Saskia Sassen, thank you very much for being with us, and we're happy to have a short interview with you about your latest book, Expulsions, which treats the globalized economy and in it the ways that is transforming our world in so many different ways. You say that the concepts that we use to understand those transformations, like rising inequality or rising poverty, are out of date and inadequate. You're not suggesting that inequality has become an unimportant issue, are you?
No, I'm not. I'm just saying that focusing on inequality is not enough, because we have always had inequality. Any complex system is going to have inequality built into it, and certainly human-made systems like a society. So the issue really is what kind of inequality is unacceptable. So for me, in a way, social justice is a more substantive concept than inequality. I've been talking about inequality for 30 years, so it's not that I want to do away with that category. Mm-hmm. But we need to make it work with another feature, and there I would say social justice. And at the other end, of course, this notion that when inequality goes beyond a certain point, we're talking expulsions, rather than simply inequality.
And where is that point? Is there? You seem to suggest in your book that the expulsions is a phase of contemporary capitalism that started more or less around 1980. Is that where we have to look to? Is this the phase of expulsions?
Yes, I'm not denying that we didn't have expulsions, 300 years ago, that kind of dynamic. But I think that for a good 200 or 300 years, capitalism was a force for expanding a certain kind of economy. In that expansion of a certain type of economy, a capitalist economy, of course, all kinds of other sectors were expelled, or they were broken down and incorporated as subordinate elements in capitalism. So especially if you take the post-World War II time, Keynesianism thrived on bringing in workers as consumers, because consumption was the critical sort of force at that point. I argue that beginning in the late 1980s, we see a new dynamic install itself in our economies. It's not that everything that was there disappears. It's that something else, big, significant, consequential, also installs itself. And at that point, I argue, and this is a process that begins 30 years ago in the United States, probably about 20 years ago in Europe, and it begins to expand, to the rest of the world, that something else happens. And so for me, expulsions are a particular moment. A familiar condition becomes so extreme that our categories for analysis, our statistics, stop recording them. Best, simplest example, long-term unemployment. At some point, they are still there, but we no longer measure them. It's like they fall off the cliff. They become statistically invisible.
And does that also mean that society or the economy doesn't care about those people anymore, that they are dispensable altogether?
You said it, exactly. It really means that you are out of the system. Now, on the other hand, and I've used Greece as an example, for instance, I think that what we have is that the operative space of the economy shrinks. There might be more wealth, more money, more very fancy technology, but it actually includes less and less of what may once have been the economy of a country. Again, Greece, Spain are extreme examples. But I think we see that also in the United States. We have not recovered since this last crisis, let alone the Keynesian period in the United States. The kinds of numbers of jobs, types of jobs, prosperous, modest middle classes, not the super rich. We haven't recovered that. And there are some interesting statistics. 65% of the jobs lost in the United States in 2008 because of this particular crisis. Of the new jobs that were middle-class jobs, 65%. Of the new jobs that we have added, only 25% are middle class. So that already gives you an indication of a shrunken economic space.
How do you explain that a global economy thrives and people get richer, a lot richer, with less incorporation of consumers and of middle classes? It seems to be against any intuition of how an economy works.
Yeah, indeed, I would agree with that. And so I went digging to try to figure it out. Number one, consumption really matters less to the system. It matters for particular sectors. But most of the wealth that has been made, which is extraordinary, just in the last 10 years or since the crises, really, and before that too. But then a little dip that I always say lasted about half an hour. The crises for the big corporations lasted about 2 years. And after that, their profit, the value of assets actually grew higher than before the crisis, which is an interesting datum. But I would say that it is finance which really is the motor for an extraordinary jump in wealth. So in 2007, 2008, when the crisis, not 2007, right before the crisis really explodes, it's already in the making, the value of financial assets as measured by derivatives, outstanding derivatives, which is a classic measure, was $630 trillion. Today, it's more than a quadrillion. Now that's a lot of zeros. I don't know how you mean. But that is an extraordinary. Those corporations that are into the consumer markets, they have not had that kind of a gain. I mean, a quadrillion is extraordinary.
But one thing that maybe is interesting to explain a bit deeper is what is the difference between financial assets and money? Because people think that the financial sector is about money, we know it.
That's right. I'm glad you asked that, because in fact, I asked myself, when I'm doing this research, well, how much actual money is there in the system? Like if you took all the central banks in the world and the currencies that they issue, which is a very wobbly figure because of inflation, corruption, the printing press, etc. But still, so today it's probably about 350 trillion. The value of finance is a quadrillion. That is a lot. That's another order of magnitude, basically. So that leads me then to say that finance, unlike traditional banking, is not about money. Money, currency. Finance is very different from traditional banking. Finance sells something it does not have. Hence, it is extremely creative, using enormously talented people in order to create instruments that allows it to invade other economic sectors. The traditional bank sells something it has, money, and charges you an interest. So that's the big difference, and that is why finance is dangerous. Finance it's like in English there is this great expression, grist for the mill. Finance produces grist for its mill by invading all kinds of other economic sectors. And to invade those sectors, it needs brilliant minds to produce the instruments. And so in that sense, finance is a kind of roving machine that is present everywhere, including in poor households, via the nexus of debt, household debt. It is a dangerous force. It's a very powerful sector.
But this finance allows the rich to live real prosperous lives in the material world, so they can buy stuff with it.
Yes, but when you have fewer and fewer who can buy, the impoverishment of our middle classes, it's happened very strongly in the US and to some extent also in Europe. Very strongly, clearly in Greece and in Spain and in Portugal and in Italy. But that is an indication that you have more and more concentration at the top, and they can consume only so much. And some of them, yes, own 15 mansions. But that's 15 mansions. That is not 200 million middle-class homes. Mm. So, it is a total distortion of a logic that would make for an expanded economic space like we had under Keynesianism. It kept expanded. modest middle classes, prosperous working classes, sure also an elite, but not what we have today.
In your conclusion of your book, you say that the spaces where people are expelled to are not mere black holes. They don't disappear from the surface of the earth, but they might be spaces of making new local economies, new histories, new belonging. Could you give maybe one or two examples to make that more concrete?
That's the best scenario, that they become spaces of making. And so, for instance, one vector in a debate that I'm part of is why should the camps for the displaced and the refugees, which often have 3 generations, why don't we allow those camps to become cities? Instead, the bureaucracy doesn't want. They want to keep them as these desperate minimalist lives that they live, often 2 generations or 3, right? So how can we transform what are now often very, very negatives? So there are possibilities of making that neighborhoods develop once again neighborhood economies, which are going to be partial, but rather than having a franchise, when you have a Starbucks, it means that some of the consumption capacity of the neighborhood, poof, goes away to the corporate. It does not recirculate. If you have your neighbor setting up a coffee shop, the money that we make will tend to recirculate in the neighborhood. So the franchising is a very negative. It's another way of sucking it up, and then it just becomes money that finance can use or whatever. But there are also spaces of such extreme misery, of such extreme poisoning of land and toxicity, you know, where you have big manufacturing and the workers are half dead and the children are ill. There is very little possibility of making. Those are spaces of death. Those are spaces that kill workers and their families, you know, over protracted, a slow death, but a death. The question for me becomes, politically, what can be done? And so in that sense, why not make these refugee camps into cities? They already are de facto like little cities. They have little shops, they have this. Enable them. Let them become a city. But no, somebody will want to own that land to set up a plantation, you know. So that is a struggle. But this is so mostly what I see is a very negative condition. And it is a question to me, when there are so many different types of expulsions, we must check out, if you want, we have to research and understand the spaces of the expelled. I don't have full knowledge, but I want to, that to me is like a next project.
The expelled people are not only up against the formidable power of accumulated capital, but also against incredible expanded computing power. That's one of the things that you bring in the book as well. Now, the increased complexity of it all makes it even harder than ever to see and let alone to change the system. Does that mean game over for the people?
No, I don't think so, because, you know, history moves on. No powerful system has lasted forever. The masses of people in misery, they seem to last forever. They're going to be there. But what is now the top, the pinnacle of power, it will self-destruct. We can't destroy it. It's too powerful. But it is so powerful that nothing can govern it. And if it does not know how to govern itself, it's finished. So something else will happen. But, you know, that is a very sort of long-term historical perspective. We look at the big capitalist firms of the Keynesian period. They're mostly dead. They're dead. These financial firms now are in deep trouble. There are many, I'm doing a whole list of all the criminal indictments. They're going to keep on living, huh? They're not about to fall. But soon, eventually, alternatives will emerge. So my take is, I have 3 vectors through which I see it. One is that how the spaces of the expelled can become interesting spaces. So we're thinking about the technology. The technology can play a very significant role. You know, I have tracked a group of Spanish techies, technologists. They were all, they lost everything. They went and occupied, they'd never been in a rural area. They occupied an abandoned rural village in mountains, very not easy terrain, but that had once been agriculture. And and it took them 2 years. They fixed it up. They raised food, and now they are selling food. What helped them was that they also knew how to do the digital bit. You see, because they created markets for themselves. Their story became a famous story. Now that is just one little, that is not going to solve our problems, right? So it is a different type of thing, but that's one example. That's one vector. Other two vectors I'll tell you later.
Okay. No, one of the things that I sort of missed in the book was a more thorough approach to the military points or the military side of keeping the system in place. You look at the political, the financial, but what we see a militarization in a sense
Absolutely.
Of power.
I agree with that. That is very strong. Well, we see a financializing of power and we see a militarizing of power. But I think I did a lot of that in my territory book. Now I'm writing a little book on territory. I use the category territory to look at all kinds of dimensions. And there I will get at the military, at the surveillance, at imprisonment, and the question is, whose land is this? And then territory as complex category.
And whose planet is this?
That's right. Right. And I must say that I wanted to keep Expulsions as a small book, and my main concern was to bring in the biosphere bit, the chapter at the end called Dead Land, Dead Water, which was the chapter that I really got most involved with, because the financial stuff I had sort of been doing for years. And this notion that till about 30 years, the biosphere was able to rebalance all our destructions, which after all started from the moment we got on this planet. But in the last 30 years, we have actually won the war of destruction. And the biosphere, I say that with irony, and the biosphere is no longer able. So we literally have dead land and dead water. And I argue, why use the sort of so civilized language of climate change? Let's call it by its name, dead land, dead water.
In which you argue that the expulsions that are taking place are not only expelling people, but life as it is.
Bits and pieces of life from their life space, so to say. That's correct, right. And I think that in that sense, this to me then also gives meaning to this notion of the Anthropocene, It is different. Because we have now put the biosphere in a place where she cannot renew. Now we can do all kinds of things to try to reduce the damage, but we're not going to get there at all. This is a big argument that I make also. I mean, a forceful argument with the policies. We've got to bring in the knowledge of biologists, the knowledge of material science people. Every surface in a city should be working. A street should have photovoltaics in it to produce energy. We have to use certain bacteria to cover certain types of walls so that they seal off greenhouse gas emissions, so that they actively purify the air around a building. We have to begin to use new materials that work with the biosphere. For instance, the return of wood as a critical material, the use of mushrooms, which can create a very, very strong surface. We have got to work in a knowledge space that goes absolutely beyond policy. I don't have anything about policy, but it's just getting us nowhere.
Some people would argue that will only happen the moment big corporations think they're going to get big profits out of this innovation or transition.
No, I disagree. The big corporations, I've not even talked about them in this. They're going to keep on doing what they're doing. But that does not mean that we, the rest, should not roll up our sleeves and say, what can I do? So there is all kinds of implementing of interesting interventions in small space. So the business corporate centers, I'm not going to deal with that. And nor am I going to say, because they exist, I can't do anything. But the rest, most urban terrain is not like those corporate centers. It is a lot of little buildings with a lot of, as they might say, little people. And there one can initiate. I also see this as a political process. If if you can mobilize people, and I have a whole long list of nice things that could be done, you can mobilize people over the weekend in using a paint that has a bacterium that seals off their buildings, you are also putting them in a process of the social, the political, but not as complaining to power, give me a bit more. No, we make it, we transform it. So I don't see anytime soon that this corporate complex, which I call a formation, it's not just particular individuals and particular firms, it's a mix of things, pieces of law, pieces of accounting, concentrations of capital, certain types of firms, certain types of corporate imaginations, if you want, brilliant imaginations. But it's not just people. I think that is going to be very difficult to dismantle. But as it leaves us a bit alone because we don't matter, hey, we should become innovators and we should become makers, in the sense of making something. That is sort of my take. So I don't want to be oppressed by the notion that center of power I cannot kill. Nor do I want to be oppressed by the notion that if it doesn't enter the profit circuit, it can't happen. Yes, it can happen. Because it is a different world. And it is not what will eliminate the big corporate center, but it will relocalize. I always say, let's relocalize. Whatever we can relocalize, bits and pieces, no franchises. We make our own mom and pop. Urban agriculture. The whole notion of coins, the currencies to do exchange. These are all little interventions, but let them grow, let them grow, let them grow. Most of the people live in small, medium-sized towns. Most of the people live in modest settings. Those are settings where we can do this. But it means we have to work with material science experts, we have to work with biologists, we have to work with technologists, there are all kinds of things.
So you're not saying let's retreat from progress,
no,
but let's accelerate progress, but on another level.
Exactly. Let's use these different types of knowledges. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much for this interview.